But Baalbek, if there was one example, one ancient site on Earth that is evidence of a lost, ancient, advanced civilization.
They tell you Baalbek is just another Roman ruin. But beneath those famous columns sits a foundation made from the largest stones ever moved by human hands.
The giant blocks in the foundation are clearly of a different building style than the temples that sit above.
The strange part? The Romans never claimed they built it. No records, no inscriptions, just silence.
That the ones that were installed were not built by the Romans, but the ones that were quarried were made by the Romans. They were trying to quarry out stones to match it.
So today we're going underground to the layer history tried to forget. Because once you see what's buried beneath Baalbek, everything you thought you knew about ancient engineering starts to fall apart. The platform no one talks about. Most people walk into Baalbek with their eyes already aimed upward. They come for the columns, the towering shafts of limestone that once held up the largest Roman temple ever built. They take photos, they read the plaques, they admire the symmetry, and then they leave thinking they've seen another impressive Roman ruin. But the real story isn't above their heads, it's under their feet. Because long before your eyes ever reach the Temple of Jupiter, you're already standing on something that should not exist. A foundation so extreme, so oversized, and so out of place that even modern engineers still argue about how it was done. Here's the part almost no tour guide leads with. The Roman temple you see today does not sit directly on bedrock. It rests on a massive artificial platform called the podium, built from some of the largest stone blocks ever cut by human hands. And these aren't decorative stones. They're not walls, they're not columns. They are structural load-bearing foundation blocks. Each one weighs between 800 and 1,000 tons. The largest stones used in the Great Pyramid of Giza weigh about 80 tons. Stonehenge's heaviest stones barely reach 25 tons. Even the famous Egyptian obelisks that Romans transported across the Mediterranean rarely exceeded 300 tons. At Baalbek, the smallest of the giant foundation stones is more than twice that. And they're not rough. They're precision cut, perfect rectangles, sharp edges, flat faces, fitted together so tightly that even today you can't slide a sheet of paper between them. No mortar, no filler, just stone pressed against stone with millimeter accuracy. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. The Roman temple above this platform was built in the 1st century after Christ, we know that. Coins, inscriptions, architectural styles, and imperial records all point to the reign of Augustus and his successors. But the foundation underneath does not behave like Roman construction. And the deeper archaeologists looked, the stranger it became. When German and French teams began detailed surveys in the 20th century, they noticed something subtle but crucial. The masonry style of the lower podium does not match Roman podiums anywhere else in the empire. Roman foundations are usually layered, stepped, and built with standardized block sizes. Baalbek's lower platform ignores all of that. Instead, it uses fewer stones, far fewer. But each stone is enormous. Why would Rome abandon its own efficient system and suddenly decide to move the heaviest stones ever attempted at the far edge of the empire in a seismic zone with no precedent and no explanation? And here's the first crack in the official story. The Romans documented everything. They carved inscriptions bragging about who built what and when. They wrote manuals about cranes, pulleys, levers, counterweights, and stone transport. Vitruvius described lifting systems in obsessive detail. Pliny catalogued engineering marvels with pride. Yet not one Roman text ever mentions moving a stone of 800 tons. Not here. Not anywhere. No emperor takes credit. No engineer signs his name. No historian records the greatest construction feat in Roman history. That silence is not normal. And then archaeologists notice something even stranger. The podium is built in layers. The upper layers, closer to the visible temple, use normal Roman blocks, smaller, familiar, manageable. But the lowest courses, buried deeper and harder to see, use a completely different technique. Fewer stones, much larger, far more precise. Almost as if two different building traditions worked on the same platform, separated by time. This is where the first serious theory begins to whisper. What if the Romans didn't build the foundation at all? What if they found it? That idea sounds radical until you look at the archaeology. Human occupation at Baalbek goes back at least 9,000 years. That predates the Great Pyramid by over 4,000 years. Long before Rome, long before Greece, long before written history. The site was sacred long before Jupiter ever arrived. The Phoenicians called it the city of Baal. The Greeks called it Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Every culture that passed through treated this place as special. But none of those cultures, as far as we know, had cranes capable of lifting 1,000 tons. And yet, the stones were already there. This leads to one of the most unsettling patterns at Baalbek. The Romans appear to have adapted their architecture to fit the platform, not the other way around. The podium's dimensions dictated the temple's footprint. The orientation was fixed, the height was predetermined, as if the foundation came first, and the temple came later. Modern scans add another layer to the mystery. When engineers used three-dimensional mapping and seismic modeling on the platform, they discovered something unexpected. The stones aren't just big. They're arranged in a way that distributes weight and absorbs earthquake motion. The foundation behaves like a modern seismic base isolator. This region sits directly on the Dead Sea Transform Fault. Powerful earthquakes have destroyed cities here again and again for thousands of years. The Roman columns fell. The courtyards cracked. Entire sections collapsed. The foundation never moved. Not one of the giant stones has shifted. No fractures, no displacement, no settling. It's behaving like a modern seismic base isolator. How did ancient builders understand load paths, shear forces, and vibration damping without calculus, without steel, without computers? That question alone has kept structural engineers awake for decades. And then comes the detail that changes everything. The podium stones were not quarried on site. They were transported from a quarry 800 meters away, across uneven ground, without wheels capable of carrying that weight, without steel cables, without hydraulic jacks, without documented lifting machines. Which brings us to the part that almost feels like a punchline. The stones used in the foundation are not even the largest stones at Baalbek, because in the nearby quarry, still attached to the bedrock, lies a block called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, 20 meters long, 4 meters tall, 4.5 meters wide. Estimated weight, 1,000 tons. And beneath it, discovered in 2014, an even larger block, 1,650 tons. The largest worked stone ever found in the ancient world, still sitting there, half cut, never moved. Which raises the most haunting question of all. Why stop? Someone invested enormous effort shaping these stones. They had a plan. They had measurements. They had a destination. And then, suddenly, the entire project ended. The stones were abandoned mid-extraction and left there for 2,000 years. No war damage, no tool marks of sabotage, no signs of collapse, just silence. It looks like a civilization that began a project beyond anything we've ever documented, and then vanished. And when the Romans arrived centuries later, they didn't demolish the platform. They didn't modify it. They didn't replace it. They built on top of it, carefully, respectfully, almost cautiously. Which leads to the unsettling possibility that the greatest Roman temple in the empire is not really standing on Roman engineering at all. It's standing on something older, something inherited, something nobody fully understands. And if that's true, then the real builders of Baalbek are still missing from history. And the foundation beneath the temple may be the last surviving fingerprint of a lost engineering tradition that was already ancient when Rome was young. But here's the part most people never hear. The foundation doesn't stop where you can see it, because new ground scans suggest the platform goes deeper than anyone realized. And beneath the visible stones, there may be more layers still buried, waiting to rewrite the story all over again. And that's where things start getting really uncomfortable. Because once you accept that the Romans may not have built the foundation, the next question becomes unavoidable. If it wasn't Rome, who was it? The quarry that proves intent. And here's where the mystery stops being philosophical and starts becoming physical. Because the foundation at Baalbek doesn't just exist. We know exactly where it came from. 800 meters southwest of the temple platform, carved directly into the limestone hillside, sits the quarry that supplied those impossible stones. You can walk there today, you can touch it, you can measure it. You can stand beside the largest cut stone ever discovered from the ancient world and realize something very unsettling. This wasn't accidental, this wasn't symbolic. This was an industrial operation on a scale nobody was supposed to have 2,000 years ago. The most famous block in the quarry is known as Hajar al-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman, a name that comes from an old folk legend claiming any woman who touched it would become fertile. But the real miracle here isn't mythology, it's math. The stone measures about 20.5 meters long, 4 meters high, 4.5 meters wide. Based on the density of local limestone, engineers estimate its weight at roughly 1,000 tons. That alone would make it the largest finished building stone ever cut in antiquity. But then archaeologists looked underneath it and found something even bigger. In 2014, excavations revealed a second block directly beneath the first. Longer, thicker, heavier, estimated at 1,650 tons, and then a third nearby. All three were deliberately shaped. Not rough quarry waste, not mistakes, not broken slabs. These were architectural stones, squared on multiple sides, clearly meant to be transported and placed into the foundation. Which means someone intended to move stones weighing more than any block ever placed at the Great Pyramid, by a factor of 20. This is where the story stops being impressive and starts becoming almost impossible. Because cutting the stones was only the first problem. The real problem was moving them. Let's be brutally honest for a moment. Moving a stone that weighs 800 tons is already borderline absurd using pre-industrial technology. Moving one that weighs 1,650 tons crosses into territory that modern heavy lift companies still treat as rare, expensive, and dangerous. Today, the strongest mobile cranes on Earth max out around 1,200 tons, and that's under perfect conditions. Flat ground, steel outriggers, computer-controlled balance systems, hydraulic stabilizers. The ancient builders had none of that. No steel, no engines, no hydraulics, no ball bearings, no reinforced concrete. And the quarry wasn't downhill. It wasn't on rails. It wasn't even flat. Between the quarry and the temple platform lies uneven terrain, shallow valleys, and subtle elevation changes that would twist wooden sleds apart under a fraction of the load. So how were these stones supposed to move? The oldest explanation is the roller theory. Logs placed under the stone, ropes wrapped around it, hundreds or thousands of workers pulling together. It sounds reasonable until you run the numbers. An 800-ton block would crush most wooden rollers instantly. Cedar of Lebanon, the strongest timber available locally, can support enormous loads, but not concentrated pressure from a stone that heavy. Each roller would need to be nearly a meter thick just to avoid snapping. And you wouldn't need a few rollers. You'd need dozens. And as the stone moved forward, workers would have to constantly recycle the rollers from back to front, perfectly synchronized, while keeping the block balanced so it didn't tip, twist, or dig into the ground. One wrong movement and the entire stone would shatter, and that's only on flat ground. The quarry path isn't flat. Then there's friction. Even with lubrication, pulling an 800-ton object across stone requires an estimated pulling force of several hundred tons. That means thousands of workers pulling at once, in perfect unison, with ropes strong enough not to snap. And ropes made of ancient hemp or leather fail at loads far below that. This is why many engineers quietly admit something uncomfortable. The classic roller theory does not scale to Baalbek. It works for 20-ton stones, maybe 50, maybe even 100 if you're bold. But 800, 1,000, 1,650, that's not transport. That's fantasy, which brings us to the tool marks. When archaeologists studied the quarry faces and the cut surfaces of the blocks, they noticed something subtle. The stones were not shaped with simple chisels and picks. The faces are unusually flat. The grooves unusually straight. Some surfaces show long continuous striations that look more like abrasive sawing than hammering. Jean-Pierre Adam, one of the leading experts on Roman construction, wrote in his book about Roman building that cutting blocks of this size would require either extremely long metal saws with abrasive sand or wire cutting systems under tension. And here's the problem. We have no evidence the Romans used wire saws on limestone at this scale. No tools, no diagrams, no descriptions. Roman quarry marks elsewhere look different. Short chisel strokes, pointed pick scars, rough surfaces later smoothed. Baalbek's foundation stones are smooth straight off the quarry floor, almost machine-like. Then there's the part that feels like the builders were showing off. The abandoned stones in the quarry are cut to match the exact dimensions of the foundation blocks already in place. Same height, same width, same proportions. This wasn't experimentation. This was mass production. They were building an entire layer of the podium from ultra-megalithic stones. And then they stopped. No tools left behind, no half-finished tracks, no collapsed ramps, no broken cranes. Just 3 perfectly cut monsters left frozen in time. Why abandon the largest construction project in human history? That question has produced more theories than almost any other site on Earth. One theory says the builders reached the physical limit of their transport system. They realized the stones were simply too heavy to move and abandoned the plan. Another suggests political collapse. A kingdom fell, a workforce scattered, funding vanished overnight. Some propose earthquakes. A tremor may have cracked the quarry floor or destroyed lifting infrastructure, forcing the project to halt. But there's a stranger detail few people talk about. The stones weren't abandoned randomly. They were left in a sequence. The largest block lies beneath the smaller one, which lies beneath the visible quarry face. The builders were deliberately attempting progressively larger stones, each one heavier than the last. A clear sequence. And then the project stopped. And centuries later, when the Romans arrived, they didn't resume the project. They ignored the quarry entirely. Instead, they used smaller stones from elsewhere to complete their temples on top of the already finished platform. Which creates a disturbing implication. If the Romans had built the foundation themselves, why abandon the quarry stones? Why leave the largest blocks ever cut sitting there unused? Why switch to smaller stones when the hardest part, cutting and shaping the giants, was already done? It doesn't make sense. Unless the Romans were never part of that project to begin with. Unless they inherited a half-finished megalithic foundation from a culture that disappeared before finishing its work. And here's the final detail that makes this theory hard to dismiss. The quarry stones align with the deepest layer of the podium, not the Roman layers above. The size sequence matches the bottom course, not the upper Roman masonry, which means the quarry operation belongs to the same builders who laid the lowest foundation layer, not the Romans who finished the temple. And that brings us back to the most uncomfortable conclusion of all. Someone before Rome attempted to build the most extreme stone foundation in human history. They had a plan. They had techniques we barely understand. They pushed stone cutting and transport to the absolute edge of possibility. And then they vanished, leaving behind a platform so perfect, so stable, and so intimidating that every civilization after them simply built on top of it and quietly pretended it had always been theirs. But here's the part that changes everything. The quarry stones may not be the biggest secret at Baalbek, because recent scans suggest the platform itself may hide deeper layers, older layers. Structures buried below the visible foundation that nobody has fully excavated yet. And if that's true, then what we see today may only be the top of something much older. And the real builders of Baalbek may still be waiting under the stones. The Roman silence problem. And this is where the mystery stops being about stones and starts being about people. because at this point you can argue about rollers, you can debate cranes, you can invent clever pulley systems and lost lifting tricks. But there is one problem that no engineering theory has ever been able to solve. The Romans never said they built this, not once. And that might be the strangest detail in the entire Baalbek puzzle. Rome was not shy. Rome was obsessed with credit. Emperors carved their names into bridges, aqueducts, baths, roads, arches, walls, gates, and temples across 3 continents. Engineers signed projects. Governors left dedicatory plaques. Victories were immortalized in stone. Construction manuals were written. Diaries were kept. When the Romans moved a single obelisk from Egypt to Rome, they wrote about it. They celebrated it. They staged public spectacles around it. Pliny described the ropes, the ships, the cranes, even the accidents. When they raised Trajan's column, they documented the scaffolding. When they rebuilt the Pantheon, we know exactly who commissioned it and when. The Colosseum? Commissioned by Vespasian, finished by Titus, dedicated in the year 80 after Christ. Roman engineering pride was legendary. So now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If Rome had moved and placed the largest stone blocks in human history, why didn't they tell anyone? Walk through Baalbek today and you'll find inscriptions everywhere. On columns, on architraves, on altars, on courtyards. They mention emperors, dedications, gods, restorations. They talk about the temples. They never mention the foundation. Not one inscription at Baalbek claims responsibility for the trilithon blocks. No plaque says we placed the great stones. No emperor boasts about the miracle. No engineer signs his masterpiece. Even stranger, the ancient authors who loved describing impossible construction feats are silent. Vitruvius, the great Roman architect, wrote 10 entire books on building techniques. He explained cranes, pulleys, counterweights, treadwheel hoists, lifting towers, and stone transport methods in painful detail. He never mentions anything remotely approaching 800 tons. Pliny the Elder, who catalogued marvels from across the empire, never mentions Baalbek's foundation. No historian describes the operation. No poet celebrates it. No relief shows it. And this silence is not subtle. It is deafening. Because if the Romans built it, this would have been their greatest engineering achievement, by far. Lifting a 1,000-ton stone 7 meters into the air and placing it with millimeter precision would dwarf every other Roman project combined. And yet, they never claimed it. That alone has forced many mainstream archaeologists into an uncomfortable position. Some now quietly admit that the podium may predate Roman occupation. But here's where the story gets even stranger. When researchers compared the weathering patterns on the foundation stones with the Roman masonry above, they noticed something odd. The lower blocks appear more eroded. Not cracked, not damaged, just older. The edges are softer. The surface is more rounded, the micro-pitting deeper. This differential weathering suggests the foundation was exposed to the elements for centuries before the Roman temple was built. Stone weathers slowly but predictably. And in multiple studies, geologists have noted that the foundation blocks show longer exposure to the elements than the Roman temple stones resting on top of them. In other words, the foundation may have been sitting there long before the Romans arrived. Then there's the construction philosophy. Roman architecture was theatrical. It was meant to be seen. Columns, capitals, friezes, statues, inscriptions. Proportions carefully designed to impress the viewer. The foundation at Baalbek does none of that. No decoration, no carvings, no inscriptions, no symbolism. Just raw function. Massive stones fitted together in the most brutally efficient way possible to create a perfectly stable platform. It looks less like a temple foundation and more like industrial infrastructure. As if whoever built it cared about only one thing: strength, longevity, and survival. This becomes even more interesting when you examine how the Romans treated it. They didn't modify the podium. They didn't drill into it. They didn't reshape it. They built carefully on top of it. aligning their walls and columns precisely with the existing blocks, almost as if they were afraid to disturb it. In several places, Roman masonry literally wraps around the giant stones instead of cutting into them, which suggests something subtle but important. The Romans adapted their design to the foundation, not the other way around. And here's another detail almost nobody talks about. The trilithon blocks, the three massive stones forming the western wall of the podium, are not necessary. From a purely structural standpoint, smaller stones would have worked perfectly. Roman engineers were masters of arches, vaults, and layered masonry. They built stable platforms everywhere else in the empire without using anything remotely this large. So why here? Why suddenly abandon your proven methods and attempt something wildly more dangerous, more expensive, and more unnecessary? Unless the stones were already there. Now comes the detail that really unsettles historians. The earliest Roman construction at Baalbek begins in the late 1st century before Christ, but the platform's deepest layers show tool marks and masonry styles that do not match Roman quarrying traditions of that period. Some cuts appear to have been made with long, straight abrasive strokes rather than repeated chisel impacts. Some joints show fitting techniques closer to older Near Eastern megalithic traditions seen at places like Jericho, Byblos, and certain Levantine platforms dating to the Bronze Age. And the Romans never reused this technique anywhere else. Not in Rome, not in Gaul, not in Spain, not in North Africa. Nowhere in the entire empire do we find another foundation built this way. An empire that built over 50,000 miles of roads across 3 continents never repeated this technique anywhere else. Which raises an obvious question. If Rome had the technology to move 1,000-ton stones, why didn't they ever do it again? Why not build the Colosseum on megaliths? Why not support the Pantheon with trilithons? Why not show the world what they could do? Rome loved spectacle. They would never hide their greatest achievement. And yet Baalbek stands alone. One impossible foundation, surrounded by silence. This has led to a theory that many scholars now cautiously entertain, even if they rarely say it publicly. The Romans inherited the foundation. They did not build it. They found it. They recognized its strength, and they used it. There is precedent for this. All over the ancient world, later civilizations built on top of older ones. Greeks built on Mycenaean ruins. Romans built on Etruscan platforms. Medieval cities rose on Roman foundations. At Jerusalem, Herod expanded a much older sacred platform into the Temple Mount. At Cusco, the Spanish built cathedrals on Inca stonework because it was stronger than anything they could make themselves. At Baalbek, the Romans may have done the same. And if that's true, then the foundation belongs to a civilization we have not identified. A culture older than Rome, older than Greece, older than the classical world. A culture that specialized not in decoration, but in raw engineering power. And then there's one last piece of evidence that makes this theory almost impossible to ignore. The Romans had a habit of stamping their stones. Many Roman quarries left marks identifying the legion or work crew that cut the blocks. Builder marks, quarry symbols, transport codes. The Baalbek foundation stones have none of them. No stamps, no marks, no Roman signatures. Because the smaller Roman stones above them are full of markings. It's as if 2 completely different construction cultures worked on the same site, separated by centuries or longer. And now we arrive at the question nobody likes to ask out loud. If the Romans didn't build the foundation, and the Phoenicians didn't have the technology, and the Greeks didn't attempt anything like this, who did? Because the foundation didn't build itself. Someone cut those stones, someone moved them, someone placed them. Someone designed a seismic-resistant platform that has survived thousands of years of earthquakes. And whoever they were, they left no written records, no inscriptions, no names, No myths clearly tied to them. Just stone. And here's the detail that makes this part of the story even darker. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest that the visible podium may not be the bottom. There may be deeper layers beneath the foundation, older structures, buried courses of stone that predate even the trilithon, which means the platform we see today may itself be sitting on something older. And if that's true, then Baalbek is not just one mystery stacked on another, it's a vertical timeline of civilizations, each one building on top of a past they no longer understood. And the deepest layer, the very first foundation, may belong to a culture whose name has been erased completely from history. But before we chase lost civilizations and forbidden timelines, there's one more explanation that must be examined, because some researchers believe the Romans did build it, using methods we simply haven't reconstructed yet. And that theory leads us into the most controversial part of the Baalbek mystery, the idea that ancient builders possessed lifting technologies we've forgotten. And once you follow that trail, things get strange very fast. The foundation trick exposed. And this is where the mystery finally flips on its head. Because what if Baalbek was never meant to show power? What if it was meant to hide it? Some engineers now believe the giant stones weren't placed for spectacle at all. They were placed as anchors, counterweights, a stabilizing spine designed to lock the entire platform into the bedrock beneath a major fault line. Think about it. Instead of stacking many small blocks that could shear during earthquakes, the builders locked the platform together with 3 colossal stones, each so heavy that horizontal motion becomes almost impossible. The trilithon isn't decoration, it's a seismic damper, a shock absorber made of stone. The principle is simple. Heavier objects vibrate at lower frequencies. When an earthquake strikes, the massive weight of the trilithon blocks causes them to oscillate slowly, out of sync with the destructive high-frequency waves that shatter lighter structures. Modern modeling shows the mass of those blocks shifts vibration frequencies away from destructive resonance. In simple terms, the heavier the stone, the calmer the platform behaves when the earth moves. That's why the columns fell and the foundation remained unmoved. Which means the greatest trick at Baalbek may not be how they moved the stones at all. It may be that the builders understood earthquakes so well. They deliberately used impossible stones to build a structure that could outlast civilizations. And then they let the Romans take the credit. So the real question isn't how they lifted the stones, it's why they needed them that heavy in the first place. And once you ask that, Baalbek stops looking like a temple foundation. It starts looking like an ancient machine designed to survive the end of the world. The question isn't how they moved the stones, it's what they knew was coming. If stones this massive were placed without machines, what else are we missing about our past? Was Baalbek inherited, reinvented, or misunderstood? Tap the card on screen, subscribe, and tell us what you think really happened here.